again, everyone. So you've heard from systematic theologian, myself. You've heard from spiritual direction, from Dale. You've heard from historian, from Sheila. You've heard from practical theology, Jonathan. The last of the sort of sub-disciplines that we do here at St. Francis is biblical studies. Now, I am not myself a biblical studies scholar or a Bible scholar. We do have a person for that. Her name is Mara Louise Craig. Unfortunately, she's been having some health issues recently and is unable to be with us. So we're hoping that she can return to us as soon as possible and take up her rightful space as our biblical scholar. But we wanted to give you a sense of what biblical scholars kind of do, or that we study biblical texts here and some of the complexities and exciting things around that. So I said, well, I'll step in and see if I can say something and introduce you all to something of biblical studies. So and stepping into a discipline that's not my own, I thought, how about I pick one of the most difficult and problematic texts in the Bible, and give you my take on it. So I have done that. So we're going to look at Genesis 22 today. So I've called it the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. Sometimes it's called the Akedah, which is the Hebrew term referencing that simply means binding. So that's what you'll sometimes hear it as referencing. So let me just begin. Let me read us a passage from the Bible. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him out from the heaven, "Abraham! Abraham!" "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." Okay. Just throw it out to you all. What do you do with that text? It's a text about God telling Abraham to go kill his son, and Abraham consents and says, "Sure, I'll go kill my son." And then God intervenes and says, "No, don't kill your son. Here's a ram instead." I don't know. Are there any ideas? How do you receive this text? Right, it's part of Christian, in Jewish Holy Scriptures. It's a central narrative in the Bible. It's referred to multiple times in the New Testament as a story that exemplifies Abraham's faith. What do you do with it? Any ideas? Yeah.
Retrospectively, you can be quite comfortable with it because you know what happened.
Okay.
But if you were in the middle of it and you didn't know the ending, it would be very different.
Sure. So it's got a happy ending.
It's
All's well that ends well.
kind of.
So there you go, right?
Horrific, but
Yeah, okay.
What sort of a God asks you to kill his son?
Okay, sure. Right? It's a valid question, right? Who is this God that we're dealing with? Are we supposed to worship this God? Are we supposed to love this God? Are we supposed to follow this God who may at any moment tell us to do something horrific like kill one of our own children, right? As a test. It's a good question. Anyone else?
It forces you to feel uncomfortable when you're reading it.
Okay.
If you imagine yourself in that scene, you're like, oh, holy hell. You know, it's like, I think you're meant to feel uncomfortable even though you kind of know the ending. You know, if you kind of think about it, it's like really difficult, like it's meant to be.
Yeah. Yep. Jonathan, were you going to say something?
You might. Since this is a text that wasn't initially written for us, but for another community, you might ask, oh, well, what other kind of practices were going on at the time to do with child sacrificey kind of stuff?
Yeah. Good one. Great. So, what we've got here, multiple different questions, multiple different perspectives, and perhaps some more information that's needed, like what's the context of this text, when was it written, why was it written, who was it written to, and there's multiple perspectives to come at it. So now a text like this kind of magnetizes that because it's such a powerful, potent text, right? You can ask, what is going on there? Why is this text in the Bible? Who is God in this text? Why was it written? What happened? Did it really happen exactly as we're told that it's happened, or is this a story that's told? Is this a myth that the Jewish people tell, or is this literal history? Did God really tell Abraham to do this? So, and I just want to say to you, these are all the kinds of questions that emerge when we turn to the Bible. These are just the kinds of questions and the multiplicity of engagements with the Bible that are possible. So with this particular text, I forgot to show you just a very famous Rembrandt's painting of this, Sacrifice of Isaac. I meant to show that when I began, but I forgot. And there's multiple artistic depictions of this scene of the binding of Isaac. So part of what I want to do today is simply to kind of open you up to the reality that in any given biblical text, particularly biblical texts as, troublesome as I put it, or, complex as this one, there's multiple interpretations. And the history of interpreting the biblical text is a really fascinating, long, complicated, conflicted one. Take a text like Genesis 22, and it's a text that's shared by Christians, that's shared by Jews, that's part of their, Hebrew scriptures. And the Quran also makes reference to this story in its own way. So this is a text that's shared by multiple different religious communities, and they all have their own different interpretations of it. And even within Christianity, there's lots of conflicting interpretations of this story. Within Judaism, there's lots of conflicting interpretations of this story. So I'm just going to give you overview a few of them, and then I'm going to kind of throw out to you one possible way of interpreting this story. It's not my own, I'm just borrowing it from someone, but I think it's an interesting, way of interpreting the story. I'm not going to tell you it's the only way to interpret the story, or it's the right way to interpret the story. I'm going to say it's a way to interpret the story. So, but first, just a few overviews of how this story has been taken. So you could say that a lot of Jewish interpretations of this text want to receive it as a test of Abraham's obedience, right? And this kind of goes with the grain of Genesis 22 itself, because if you keep reading Genesis 22 after I stopped, you have God saying, and now I know, that you fear me, and therefore, Abraham, you will be the chosen person, and you'll be blessed, and you'll have numerous descendants, and through Abraham, God will establish God's covenant with the earth. So the primary point of this test is a test of obedience, right? That this is the point of this passage, that God had to push Abraham all the way to the very extreme limit of doing something that, of course, no one would want to do, sacrifice their only son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, to kill them, as a test of saying that that I'm completely obedient to God and to no one else, right? That I'm willing to sacrifice everything for God, and that Abraham passes this test. Right? And because he passes this test, God doesn't actually make him go through with it, and then Abraham emerges as the, proven leader of God's people, right? That's a It's a common interpretation across. Now, there's lots of other Jewish interpretations of it that are really interesting, but we don't have time to get into. You could do an entire subject on interpretations of this text, like looking at different interpretations of this text. But that's one. Now, Christian, like distinctively Christian interpretations of this text, you get some within the New Testament itself, right? So if you turn to Hebrews 11, for instance, the author of Hebrews, commends Abraham for his faith in being willing to sacrifice his son Isaac, and says that Abraham was willing to do this because he believed that even God could bring someone back from the dead, right? So there's this belief in resurrection. There's this, which is a uniquely kind of Christian, a certain kind of Christian tinged belief that Abraham could do this because it showed that he believed even if Isaac was killed, God could raise him from the dead, and so all would not be lost. So there's a kind of particular Christian belief there that Abraham is a believer in resurrection. Or, and again, this is another common Christian interpretation, that the whole thing is a prefiguration of Christ. That it's a kind of scenario that foreshadows what Christians believe in terms of the Father sending his Son to sacrifice himself for the sins of the world, right, on certain Christian interpretations. So this is how some Christians receive this text, as a allegorical foreshadowing of the real event of kind of sacrifice that actually happens. The Son actually is sacrificed, Jesus on the cross. So that's how some Christians take it. Now, there's also, and sort of Jonathan's question points in this direction, there's also kind of historical critical readings of this text. And a historical critical reading of the text wouldn't first try to say, what's the theology of this text? It would try to say, what is this text doing in its historical context? Where does it come from? How do we situate this self in its historical context? And what might what might this text represent in terms of what's going on in a particular time and place? And there's a lot of historical critical readings of this text that say that one way to receive this story in Genesis 22 is it marks a moment within the sort of consciousness of Jewish history when Israel learned not to sacrifice children. So again, this doesn't take the stance that it doesn't read the story literally. It doesn't think God actually asked Abraham to go and sacrifice his son. It's reading it from a different kind of perspective that recognizes that in the historical time period, there were lots of practices of child sacrifice. That this was a very common religious, practice among many different religious communities, and that this story represents an emerging consciousness in Israel. However you think that happened, and a historical critical approach wouldn't answer that question. It says there was an emerging consciousness in Israel that child sacrifice is wrong. So a story develops about the founding father of Israel. He himself goes through this process of coming to consciousness that I should not sacrifice children. And that's what this story represents. So that would be a kind of critical historical approach. Now, one that's and now I'm going to get to the one that I want to spend just a bit more time with. It relates to the historical critical one, but it's a way of reading the story along those lines, but giving a bit more kind of agency to God, you might say. And it's called the Trickster narrative approach to reading this story. So I'm following here the work of the theologian Eugene Rogers. It's his particular interpretation of Genesis 22, but he's drawing on a lot of other kind of traditions of reading this narrative. And it falls within a broad tradition of reading the Genesis narrative that Abraham actually failed the test. So it's a way of taking, and God tested Abraham and said, go take your son. And that rather than thinking that Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son was a passing of the test, there's a whole tradition of interpretation that says at this point Abraham horrifically fails the test that God is putting to him. Now, why is God putting him to this test in the first place? That's part of the larger question. But this trickster narrative tries to provide an answer to it. So I've called it God's ironic subversion of Abraham's misunderstanding. So this narrative tries to read this text as saying that God essentially kind of plays along with Abraham's own misunderstanding that God wants him to sacrifice his son as a way of subverting that misunderstanding from the inside. That's the basic way of reading the story. So let me unpack that for you. So this is I'm quoting Eugene Rogers here, which is his reading of it, but I'm just going to give you a sense of his reading. So there's 3 slides, and I'll just read you through this quote, just to give you a sense of how Eugene Rogers is approaching this text. What if Abraham misunderstood or misunderstands God's desires and goes along with him as a teaching exercise? Then God's command, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, has a different tenor. The object of the imperative features a long, extended pile-up of appositives. Your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. As a speaker, as if the speaker is buying time while thinking out loud. It has a slow, building, deliberative quality. It says, I know you, Abraham. You're infected by the Malachite tendency to think that child sacrifice is a good thing to do. I'm not sure how I'm going to persuade you that this is not what I want. Maybe I have to let you go ahead with this maniacal idea and stop you well into the process. It says, okay, go ahead. I throw up my hands. Oh no, don't let me stop you, Abraham. Not yet anyway. The command, in short, is to be read as irony. The story is not tragedy. It does, after all, have a happy ending, but it has rarely been read as a dark comedy. My reading is unconventional. Is there any textual evidence for it? So, Roger's strategy is to read Genesis 22 as a dark comedy. So again, rather than reading it as some sort of horrific test of faith, rather than reading it as a tragedy, it's a dark comedy. That God, so it starts with an assumption that Abraham's willing to sacrifice his son Isaac is a horrific thing to do, and a misunderstanding of God's will, a misunderstanding of what God would want for anyone to sacrifice a child. It starts from that premise and says, how is it that this story presents God engaging with Abraham's misunderstanding so as to actually subvert it from within? That's the approach to this story. Now the key question, again, now this is the biblical studies question, this is the exegetical question that Mari Louise would have you ask, and other biblical studies person would have you ask, what's the textual evidence for it? Sure, that's a lovely way of rereading this narrative, but is there any textual evidence for this reading of the narrative? Now, Rogers points to, and again, this is what biblical theologians or biblical scholars often do, he points to one minor, interesting little feature of the text in the Hebrew that says this might give us a little clue as to the possibility of reading the story as a dark comedy in which God's command to Abraham is taken as ironic rather than direct and literal. So, the little clue in Hebrew, and again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I don't speak on my own authority about the Hebrew, I'm just piggybacking on other people who do know about the Hebrew, is this little word na, which is a combination of the Hebrews nun and aleph that make up this tiny little Hebrew word na, which is a particle, right? So in terms of parts of speech, particles are kind of little words that can float around and do interesting things and change the tenor or tone of a passage, that can do rhetorical work in a passage. So there's this little particle called na, which is a particle of entreaty. It's often left completely untranslated often in English translations of the Hebrew text because we don't really know what to do with it. It's just a little particle, but sometimes it's rendered as please. It's a sense of entreaty, or often it can have lots of different valences. So in the Genesis 22 narrative, Genesis 22:2, you find na in the first one. Take your son. So take na your son. It's there. This little particle is there in the very opening lines of Genesis 22. The question is, what is it doing there, and how do we translate it? So now, Brown, Driver, and Briggs, which is one of the standard Hebrew lexicons for reading Hebrew, says that sometimes you can take na as being used ironically as a challenge. So sometimes when this little particle shows up, it's being used to signify kind of ironic challenge or entering into some sort of like deliberative space. So just a few examples from the other parts in the Hebrew Bible. Isaiah 47:12. This is God being sarcastic and ironic. Stand fast in your enchantments and your many sorceries. Right? Obviously, this is God. God doesn't want actually the people of Israel to continue in their sorceries and their delusions. But the na there signifies that this is being spoken sarcastically or ironically. So it's this little particle of speech that signifies that this is to be read in a sarcastic way. Stand fast in your enchantments or your many sorceries. Or Job 40:10. Deck yourself, again, there's the na, with majesty and dignity, clothe yourself with glory and splendor. And if you know the context of Job, this is clearly being spoken of in an ironic or sarcastic way. So these are ironic or sarcastic uses. The question is, could you read the na in Genesis 22 as happening in a similar way? Now, the clue to this is to read what else is going on in Genesis. And na shows up in lots of other places in Genesis. precisely when some form of trickery, some form of deliberation, some form of trickster manipulation is happening, you often get this little particle showing up at key points in the narrative. So back in Genesis 12, right, when Abraham comes to Egypt and he brings his wife Sarah, but he's worried that if people perceive Sarah as his wife, they're going to want to kill Abraham to get Sarah. So Abraham comes with this idea, well, tell them all you're my sister, right? Tell them you're my sister, and therefore they'll like me instead of want to kill me so they can have Sarah. So it came about when she came here to Egypt that he said to Sarai, his wife, see now, and there's the gnaw that shows up that's signifying this maybe there's some sort of deliberative, tricky plan that's happening. See now, I know that you are a beautiful woman. Please, there's the gnaw again, say that you are my sister so that it may well go well with me because of you and that I may live on account of you. So again, one of the places where gnaw often shows up is where a deliberate scene of where trickery is happening, where there's some, in which some kind of a deception is going on or a scheming plan that's being hatched to let something, to subvert something, to let something happen. So that's another example. Another example in Genesis where gnaw shows up is Genesis 18, where Abraham bargains with God over the destruction of Sodom. So if you know, so God says, I'm going to kill everyone in Sodom, and Abraham comes back and says, oh no, please don't kill everyone in Sodom, let me bargain with you. If I can find a certain amount of righteous people there, don't kill them. So, Genesis 18. Then he said, again, the gnaw shows up, may the Lord not be angry and shall speak. Suppose 30 are found there. And he said, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, now, behold, gnaw shows up, I have ventured to speak to the Lord, suppose 20 are found there. And he said, I will not destroy it on account of the 20. Then he said, may the Lord not be angry and shall only speak this once, suppose 10 are found there. And he said, I will not destroy it on account of the 10. So here you get this, it's this sense of bargaining. It's this sense of, I'm trying to, not get you to do something, and the gnaw signifies this kind of rhetorical space that's happening there. Now, again, notice, and this is what a lot of scholars also point out, about in this interpretation of Abraham's actually failing the test. Here, when God is proposing a horrific killing of a whole city, Abraham argues with God. He pushes back. And he says, no, don't do that. Genesis 22, there's no argument. Why is there no argument in Genesis 22? There's argument elsewhere, but there's no argument in Genesis 22. So that, again, that itself is a very interesting textual detail about that's interesting, that may set up an interpretation where Abraham is actually failing at something here. So, here's Eugene Rogers again. I'm almost done. What if God is imitating Abraham's own usages? And again, the book of Genesis is full of, particularly the first 20 or so chapters of Genesis, is full of trickery, manipulation, figures doing weird things to get other figures to do weird things. So this reading is, what if God enters into the story and becomes one of the tricksters in the story? What if God is imitating Abraham's own usages, deliberative, ironic, using his wits? Say, I have an idea. Let's try this. Hey, Abraham, want to sacrifice your son? Okay, go ahead. See if I care. But maybe you'll come to your senses. It's easy to see how this tack may be the right way to deal with Abraham, whom the author of Genesis portrays as the author of Genesis 20 portrays as an even more subtle con man than does the author of Genesis 12, in a pattern of escalating manipulation. So the point is the Genesis narrative presents all kinds of patterns of escalating manipulation, and that this Genesis 22, on this interpretation, is God kind of entering into that crazy manipulative swirl of stories and tries to insert God's own manipulative subversion of something that God wants to stop, which is a misunderstanding on Abraham that he is to sacrifice his son, Isaac. So, last quote from Rogers. In the binding of Isaac, gnaw puts God in the position of the powerful at the mercy of the subordinate. God experiences the helplessness of the one who loves someone flawed and resorts to the scheming of the other Genesis tricksters, scheming which can take place in deadly earnest. So, it's a way of interpreting the story, ironically and subversively. Now, there's all kinds of, perhaps that's completely unconvincing to you, and that's fine. And there's all kinds of evidence, more evidence that you could rack up to do that. But that's just meant to kind of get you into, this is the sort of complexities and interesting things of biblical studies, and even particularly down to the very kind of jot and tittle of the language and how these things matter a lot in terms of how you interpret a story. All right, thanks.